Bigger than capes.
Give me some sadness.
Yeah, I was looking forward to it, and then I watched it.
Oh, dry.
Hello, and welcome to Bigger Than Capes. I am Angela, and this week I am joined by the writer of Scout's Honour, The OZ, Going to the Chapel, and Spencer and Locke, David Pepose. Hello, sir.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm excited to chat with you today.
You're welcome. So, anyone who's checked out our website will know we have been reviewing Scout's Honour. So, if we can start with asking you a bit about Scout's Honour.
Sure.
And I guess the most obvious question is, were you a scout?
So I have an interesting answer for that, in that my younger brothers were scouts. I was not. There's about almost a 10-year age gap between me and my younger siblings, and my younger siblings are triplets. And so for me, I was like the crash test dummy baby, where like I didn't do a whole lot of extracurriculars because my parents were still figuring out how to be parents. Whereas when the triplets were born, it was like, let's throw them into all the extracurriculars so we can get a house to ourselves again. And so my brothers both had some fairly short-lived careers as Boy Scouts. And I think that really informed the series in a big way, as being the outsider looking in. For my brothers, it was all about the camaraderie, and it was learning practical skills and hanging out with your boys, and maybe a little friendly rivalry thrown in as well. Whereas for me, you see the outfits, and you see the bylaws, and you see the rituals, and you see the traditions, and you don't have to squint too hard to sort of make that leap to what if that looked like a cult. And that was really the central kernel of kind of how that book started, was what's the weirdest thing that somebody could use as a Bible? And when I thought of a Boy Scout manual, I had all these memories coming back of my younger brothers, and I was just like, oh yeah, that would be really weird. And really that the ball kind of started from Scout's Honor right there.
So that was the inspiration behind it. Because I was going to say, there is clearly a connection between the Scouts and a religious cult. It does feel a bit like that. Yeah.
Well, the Scouts are very much, and it's funny, they for an organization that actually started in Britain before being taken to the US. I think it's really kind of dovetailed into sort of the evangelical streak that the U.S. in particular has had over the last 70 years. And I feel like, we tied in things like Scientology. I've been watching a show called The Path with Aaron Paul that was like a very big inspiration on this, is sort of what happens when you try to leave a Scientology-style cult, and kind of what happens to you, what happens to your family, what happens to the cult itself. But I think, you look at it and it's kind of like, well, the U.S. especially, we've got this sort of culture of toxic masculinity. We've got this fetishizing of the military and survival preppers. We've got this sort of rise of this evangelical megachurches, and kind of, turning our noses at education and critical thinking. And you kind of put all that in a cauldron and throw a couple nukes at it, and suddenly the Ranger Scouts don't look that far-fetched.
No.
It's definitely a book that, when I pitched it, it seemed timely, but then as I wrote it during a pandemic, it seemed really timely. And just based on kind of the way that the comics industry works, I had pitched this well before the pandemic started, but by the time I got my contract and we actually started work, it was about a week before everything shut down in the US. And so it definitely, it was a book that felt very real. And the fact that, like, the first day it came out, there also was like an attack on the Capitol, a violent insurrection, and just, it was a book that felt sometimes uncomfortably timely.
Yeah.
But I feel like at the same time, anybody who's read my work, I tend to start bleak and then I try to work my way out. And so, it's always darkest before the dawn. And so I feel like, I think people who have read our most recent issue 4, I think they're starting to see the light starting to kind of filter through. And we're going to kind of ride that for our 5th and final issue that'll be coming out next month. And so, it's just, I always try to work my way up. I don't want to write bleakness for bleakness' sake. I want there to be a point. Because I do, believe it or not, believe in happy endings. And Scout's Honor is going to be no exception to that.
That's good to know, because it is. I like how you said that it is bleak, but it does go up, and that's what I like, because it is very timely, and obviously it's been a bleak time.
Yes.
And it's nice to have a bit of hope, and I think that's what's really good about Scout's Honor, is even though, there's some bleakness, it's never without that kernel of hope in there. And I mean, issue 4, I think, is probably the best one yet. I know you're quite fond of issue 4, is that right?
I think it's my favorite of the whole series, to be honest. I think it speaks most to some of the personal elements that I've had for this book. I've talked about it before, but in a lot of ways, Scout's Honor, all my books are semi-autobiographical to some extent, but I think Scout's Honor might be the most. I was raised in a particularly conservative, both politically and religiously, Jewish household in the Midwest. And it wasn't until I left home that I kind of suddenly, it was very jarring to realize, like, all these things that I had been raised to believe weren't really as set in stone as I had been taught. And it was so disorienting having to kind of recalibrate your own internal compass based on new knowledge. And yet I think that's a quintessential part of coming of age. And so that, in a big way, really informed the structure of Scout's Honor. The thing is, I said, it's an anti-cult book, but I wouldn't say it's an anti-religion book. I cling to my identity as a Jewish person. My spiritual path's very different than my parents', which is very different than that of their parents. And Judaism in particular as a religion, it's based on literary analysis. You've got 5 different rabbis giving 10 different interpretations of the same passage. And then we keep all of that apocryphal stuff in the margins. So it's built on a wide spectrum of interpretation and belief and practice. And Scout's Honor, building up that world in that sense, you're kind of like, all right, like, you've got the Boy Scout imagery, you've got the post-apocalyptic imagery. Where's the religion in this? The creation myth is based on explosions and bombs. I think issue 4 in particular really speaks to, like, faith can be used to justify some awful, hideous things, and has been quite a bit in history. But on a personal level, on a one-to-one level, sometimes faith is that thing that carries you across the finish line when you've got nothing else left in the tank. It's something that, what do you believe in? And that doesn't have to be religious. That doesn't even have to be spiritual. What do you believe in that's bigger than yourself? And I think we all have to some extent. And that is the thing that I think we get to dive into the most in issue 4 out of the whole series. And so it's a quieter issue compared to, like, the Hunger Games style Eagles Garden trials that we had in the previous issue. But I think it's the most personal, and I think it's the most intense. And so I'm so thrilled with how it came together. When, at least for me, I don't know if it's different for other comic writers, but for me, I'm always holding my breath until the colors and letters come in. That's when I kind of know, did we stick the landing? Yeah. And when it all came, when Christina Harrington, our editor, sent me the final PDF, and I was like, oh, thank God. Okay, it worked. It turned out. And so, issue 4, it's really my favorite of the bunch. And I'm so thrilled that so far people really seem to be responding to it.
I think it's because, like you said, it's something we can all relate to, that faith and belief, no matter what the background is. Most of us have that sort of experience. I was brought up Catholic, so I have issues with organized religion. So I could personally relate to what was going on there, and all about personal belief and personal faith, and how that can actually push you forward was actually, I thought, that was really nice.
Thank you. Yeah, I think so much of this book is kind of like, for Kit especially, it's kind of like she was raised believing something. And in certain ways, the Ranger Scout creed, it's all about self-sufficiency, and it's all about surviving in kind of a lawless, dangerous landscape. But then she's finding out that there's all this sort of sinister stuff going on underneath the surface, and it breaks her heart. And so she's kind of got to figure out, how do you extract those toxic pieces, and what do you keep? How do you move forward without throwing out the baby with the bathwater? But what do you replace those missing pieces with? How do you refine your trajectory? And so we'll get into that in issue 5 as well. And I will say that there's another character that I think it's a really strong emotional moment in our last issue that we weren't able to quite get into in issue 4, but I'm really happy. I think we might be saving the best for last.
See, this makes me happy. This makes me happy. Did you have the whole thing plotted out from the get-go? You knew exactly where it was going to end, or was it like, did you change your mind at all?
Yeah. So, well, this was an interesting process in general. Scout's Honor was very different than any other book I've put together, because most series that I do, it's what I call the image model. You know, you come up with the whole story, you find your own team, you self-finance, you put together however many pages you're going to pitch with, and then you shop it around. It's very thumbs up, thumbs down, very binary.
Yeah.
But there are some publishers like Aftershock or Boom where they want to be more hands-on. And so, like, for example, this is the first book I've had my creative team match made for me. That was very new and definitely a learning curve for sure. But on top of that, that means that Aftershock, there was kind of a staggered way of going about the pitch process. Where at first I said, here's a series of log lines of some concepts that I'm interested in. And if anything stands out to you, let me know and I'll flesh it out. It's funny because I had a lot of long-standing concepts, some of them that are still long-standing on that list. And Scout's Honor was the one that I had come up with like 2 weeks prior. And of course, that's the one that they went for. And I was like, oh, crap, that's the one I've done no thinking, no research. So I wrote that out in about a month. And well, what happened was when I first pitched it, there was no Kit. The idea of Kit being a woman came during the outline stage. It was not during the log line. It was when Aftershock said, "Oh yeah, let's do the post-apocalyptic Boy Scout. Like, let's see what you can come up with there." I was like, yes, excited, and then secondly, I was like, oh crap, that like an all-male book is not going to fly. When I pitched it was 2019, and I was like, that's not going to fly. And then I realized, like, no, lean into that. Like, let's make the lead character a woman who has to sort of survive in this very patriarchal, male-dominated society. Lean into it. That is weird. And there were definitely some things that changed a bit in the outline stage, even in the scripting stage. This is a fun little bit of trivia. The Scout's Prayer that I opened issue 4 with was actually originally the introduction issue 2. And I had written issue 2 was a fun. I'm very proud of that issue because I wrote a script, sent it to Aftershock, they approved it, and then as soon as they approved it, I had this sinking feeling in my stomach being like, I could do better. And so I rewrote it. I rewrote about 75% of issue 2.
Wow.
And so some bits I strip mined, like the Scout's Prayer. I was like, I'm going to save that. I think that we could use that for a more desperate moment. The bit of Dez and Kit sharing a kiss and sort of that miscommunication that really kind of puts a wedge in their friendship. Yeah. That was in that moment. Yeah, there were definitely little bits and pieces here. I will say there's a I won't spoil anything. There were 2 bits of art in this particular issue 4, that when you're kind of racing the clock on deadline, and when you're working for a publisher like Aftershock, they have pretty strict deadlines as far as the art goes. I was well ahead of schedule for the scripting, but I have it easy. I don't have like drawings, manual labor, like that's actually work. And so, and Luca doesn't speak English. We're translating all of our scripts through his agent. And so there were a couple little curveballs in the art that came in. There were 2 to be exact that I was kind of like, oh, the art came in and Luca does not have time to redraw this. So I had to kind of like pivot a little bit to be like, all right, how am I going to rewrite this in lettering to make this work? I'm really happy how it turned out. And the fact that no one has seen it was a good learning experience for me as a writer, just to be like, you really don't have to be that precious. Like you can be nimble, you can figure things out. But yeah, there've definitely been a lot of changes to just it was an ongoing evolving process writing this book, more so than I think anything else I've written. And I think it's because the timetable was so much faster, and because this was my first experience with a bigger publisher like Aftershock, especially working with Mike Martz, who I've known since I was in college, back when he was a DC editor and I was a DC intern. I was like, I can't screw this up. I have to do this right. And so as a result, I've really had to become like a more nimble writer and really figure out, like, when I'm writing scripts, what kind of reference do I need to put in so my artist knows what to do? How do I measure twice so my artist can only cut once?
Yeah.
And I think it's been a really good experience, and I think it's something that I'll be taking with me for every project I do down the line.
Yeah, I was going to ask, how is it working with, well, there we go, Luca, who doesn't speak English.
Yeah.
And a creative team that, did Aftershock suggest them to you then? Was that how it went?
Yeah. So what happened was, so it's funny. We were figuring. I signed my contract a week before everything shut down, and I had gone home to Missouri for a funeral while I was like getting the contract, and while Mike and Christina were being like, okay, here's some potential artists, and we were kind of going back and forth for a little while on it because I'm very picky. I feel like that's been like the secret to my success is I have a pretty strong idea of what I want. And having been a critic before I became a creator, I always approach any project with what would I have said if I was a critic, and if I wouldn't like it as a critic, I don't feel like it's right to present it to readers. And so we went back and forth. I know Mike gave me a list, and then I gave Mike a list, and then Mike said, oh, hey, actually Luca Casalanguida is looking for work. And I was thrilled when he said that, because I had actually reached out to Luca years ago about another project, and he was busy working on a small independent book called James Bond. And so he couldn't do it at the time. And so I was like, I already know Luca's work. I'm really familiar with it. And I was like, if Luca feels confident pulling this off, then yeah, I would love to have him. And so we got Luca on board, I think, like that day. I think wow. I think it was very hurry up and then like full speed ahead. And then Matt Milla, I think Matt might have been the final person we brought on board. It was him or Carlos Manuel, our letterer. But Matt, I remember Christina saying, "How do you feel about Matt Milla on colors?" And I remember my response was, "We're allowed to do that," just because Matt is such a prolific colorist over at Marvel. I'm such a huge fan of his work on Daredevil. And the thing that Mike taught me when I was at DC is that, good art makes or breaks a comic. Everybody knows that. But it's good colors that make or break your art. And so I'm very deliberate about who I work with on colors, perhaps more so than I am with even the line art. I have to find the right colorist. And so Matt, I was just like, oh, yeah. That's wonderful. That's somebody I don't have to worry one bit about whether or not he's going to nail it. I think in the 5 issues that we've done together of Scout's Honor, I can count on one hand the number of times I've asked for any changes. He's the real deal. And then Carlos is fantastic. He really adds a nice like grittiness to this story, just in the lettering choices. It's something that I wouldn't have thought to do, but I think when I saw it, I was like, oh, that makes perfect sense. And it's a way that kind of like makes the book stand apart, from anything else I've done in the past. I know when we were putting it together, I was particularly worried about, is there going to be too much overlap with the OZ, which I had been working on for quite a while on that. And seeing the final product and seeing how they've sort of come out, I'm like, oh, these feel very different to me now. But at the time, that was like my biggest concern. And I think Carlos in particular, it's a subtle tweak, but it's one that I'm like, oh yeah, that really makes this book feel different. And so it's been nice, but it's also been a lot of pressure. I'm the new guy, comparatively speaking, to all these other people who have much bigger credits and a much longer list of credits. And so it's really inspired me to kind of bring my A game where I'm like, I have to. I can't. If this book fails, it's not going to. It can't be on me. And so that's really that's raised my blood pressure maybe, but it's definitely it's pushed me to really go to the mat for this book. Yeah.
I was going to say it does feel a complete book. It's not one of those books where you go, nah, the art's not great. It would be great except for the colouring or except for the lettering. Every part of it is really good.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's what, and I like that you mentioned the letterer, because we have a thing with Bigger Than Capes that we do pay attention to the lettering, and we feel like with it, we feel a little bit geeky doing it, but you're quite right. Even the lettering is important.
For me, and I feel a sense of gratitude every time, for every element of this work that I do, whether it's writing the scripts or whether it's finding the creative teams to work with or even doing publicity for the book. I feel like I tried every stable job, and I don't know if I was necessarily that good at them. This is a job that I feel like I can be good at. And when I was in college, I asked myself, what's my astronaut job? And this is it. I'm in my astronaut job. And so, I feel like every single person who works in my books in some capacity, like I owe them huge for it. And especially the letterers, because I feel like if I have one weakness as a comics writer that I'm still kind of shaking out, I have a pretty strong metric of like how many words can I fit per panel or per caption or per balloon. But I always tend to forget that some words are longer than others, and that makes the metric get really screwed up. And so I feel bad because I oftentimes, my letter, the first pass comes in and I'm like, oh, that balloon is way too long. I got to cut. And so I always thank my letterers because I'm like, I'm sorry that we have to make these changes. We're not rewriting, but like, I know it's time out of their schedule that they'd rather not have to waste on me. But, at the end of the day, I always say, like, I promise the final product will be worth it. And thankfully, any time that a collaborator gets annoyed with me in the process of making a book, I'm like, just wait till the book comes out. And then it comes out and they're like, okay, I guess you were worth it.
Yeah, they were all worth it in this case.
Yeah, they're all worth it in the end.
They're all worth it. Everyone's worth it in this one. So we've mentioned Kit. Can we dig a little bit deeper into Kit? Because it's Kit's one of those strong characters, but strong character is such a nondescript term these days because everyone uses it. But what I like about Kit is that her strength isn't necessarily in the physical, which she's definitely got, but it's also in the faith and the belief and the grit and determination. Yeah. So one thing we have tried to do in the reviews is try and not use too many she pronouns. Sure. Because how do you view Kit as that sort of a character? Yeah. Well,
first off, I it's funny because people have asked me like what sort of pronouns would Kit prefer to use, and it's one of those things. I had said like she and her, but I think as I had written it and as I had worked on the book, I think it's one of those things. I think that's because that's sort of that conversation wouldn't be had in the post-apocalyptic sort of Boy Scout universe that she's in. Like I have the feeling if Kit was living in like modern day 2021, that might be a very different conversation, of somebody who might consider themselves gender fluid or non-binary. But at the same time, like I knew walking in, like this would be a character that like especially would resonate with trans readers. This is a character who is binding her chest, and we had a conversation about it because I really wanted to be careful with that. Like I wanted to make sure that like we weren't being exploitative. We certainly wouldn't try to make this titillating or anything like that. And we have some lines in issue 4 that I felt, based on the conversations I've had with trans friends and people who do wear binders, it's about feeling comfortable in their own skin and feeling like they present as who they identify as. And that's where I felt like it kind of converged, is that like Kit, at the end of the day, when you strip everything away, Kit isn't just a true believer, but Kit has risked it all because she wants to be a Ranger Scout. And so every time that she puts on that binder and every time she puts on those merit badges, she's like, I'm self-actualizing and exactly the way that I want to be. And I feel like every time that I try to tackle something that might be considered a tightrope, I guess, I always defer to how can I be humane about it? Like I know nobody's experience is going to be holistic. It's never going to be sort of representative of the whole. But how, I never want to punch down. I never want people to feel like I'm trying to exploit their lived experience or to thumb my nose at it. That's certainly. And so Kit in particular, that was something that I've always been thinking about with this book. Scout's Honor, in a lot of ways, like I talked about my Midwestern upbringing. And when you strip this whole book away, it really is about, a small conservative isolated town and what happens to people who don't fit that rigid heteronormative mold. You've got Kit, and I'll have some minor spoilers, but the idea of making her best friend Des gay, I thought was a really important thing to add into this book, because it's sort of it's approaching it from a different angle, where it's sort of he's the pastor's son who's in the closet, and how tragic is that? That's I love writing Kit, but I as I've written the series, I feel like Des might be my favorite character in the book. He is the Loki to Kit's Thor, but he's deeper than that. Like I get why. I get what is sort of driving him, because there's sort of that he's caught between who he is and trying to be true to himself and the crushing expectations of his society and of his father, and this overwhelming feeling that because of Kit, he'll never measure up. Yeah. I think that's the thing that kind of unites them in a tragic way. They're best friends who each have a secret that is really that it is a core truth about them that they can't tell each other. And what's it like to kind of live your life with that emotional armor up all the time, that you always have to be on your guard, always have to be watching your back? That's kind of crushing. And I think that's a journey that I think a lot of people go through. I think living a true, authentic life can be a lifelong struggle for people, especially the more conservative their upbringing. And so I always tried to be as humane about it as I could be with these characters. And I think by the time you read our fifth and final issue, I think both characters get a nice sense of closure that I think they'll get to live their authentic life in the sun.
That's good. I'll keep an eye out for that.
Yeah.
But no, it's great because he is very sympathetic. Yeah. Even though he's Kit's rival, you really do feel for his situation as well.
I like Des a lot. And when I saw Luca's design for him, I was like, yeah, that's like Kit. It was kind of in my head already, like, just saying, it's got to be an androgynous figure. And I tend to lean towards murderous gingers in my work, and with Spencer and Locke. But it's a little bit of a storytelling cheat, because then it's like it doesn't matter how distant the character is. You see that little red thing on the top of their head, and you know which character it is. So it's a little bit utilitarian. But Des, I was kind of like, well, here's a couple different options, and Luca nailed it on the first try, and I was like, yep, that's our poor kid. And so he's a real tearjerker every time I write him. But seeing the way that he and Kit's friendship has sort of been built up and then devolved, and now it's sort of at rock bottom, and kind of seeing what the fallout's going to be in issue 5, that's probably my favorite part of that issue.
Yeah. Let's hope for them. To switch tack slightly, so we'll go with similar characters, because Dorothy in the OZ, she's got traumas.
Yes, boy, the OZ, that's a really special book for me in a lot of ways. It's been a long time coming. When the first volume of Spencer and Locke came out, I did not know if I would write another book. I was very, that's a book that, like, when you say, what if Calvin and Hobbes grew up in Sin City? That's like a book that you either succeed or you fail, but you don't do it quietly. There's no way to be quiet about a book like that. And so I was kind of like, if people hate this book, and there will be people who hate it just based on pure concept and principle, it was the hardest thing I've ever done. Like, I was like, if people hate this, I'm not doing this again. And I didn't know what the ratio was going to be of people who got what we were doing and people who just hated it on principle. And thankfully, it was like 99% people got it and really seemed to like it. And the 1% who didn't like it, that's their prerogative. I don't blame them. So when the dust settled, and I was like, okay, I haven't been excommunicated. Like, I can still write these books. I came up with 3 ideas. And the first one was Spencer and Locke 2. The second was Going to the Chapel. And the third was the OZ. And so like I said, this book has been in the works for 4 years now. And so it's taken a long kind of winding journey for it. But I think the OZ is cut from a very similar cloth to Spencer and Locke. You know, not just sort of the reimagining of childhood storytelling and making it dark, but the trauma. I think trauma is something that really that's a common theme in my work. I think even for lighter stuff like Going to the Chapel, you know, in a lot of ways, Kit is sort of the exception to most of my characters, where like she's not long marinating in her trauma like everybody else I write. She's sort of reacting to it in real time. But Dorothy, Dorothy kind of comes from both, you know, just sort of the exploration of trauma and psychology that I like to do in my work. But before I wrote comics, I was a newspaper reporter. And one of the sort of sub beats that I covered beyond sort of crime and state politics, I covered the local military beat and the local mental health beat. And so I interviewed a lot of returning veterans to Berkshire County, Massachusetts, which was kind of already an economically depressed area in the height of the recession. And talking to soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, coming back home to this sort of economically depressed place and figuring out, like, where do I go from here? You know, how do I relate to both the people who don't know what I went through overseas, to this sort of noisy and bustling kind of lack of routine that makes up the traditional American experience these days, and sort of how do we cope? You know, how do you deal with the PTSD? How do you deal with traumatic brain injury? How do you deal with the hypervigilance? And how do you deal with sort of feeling this lack of structure and this lack of direction that you felt when you were overseas? And so Dorothy represents all that to me. You know, she in many ways is my Sarah Connor. You know, and I think out of all the characters I've ever written, it's like a real like nose to nose between Dorothy and Locke, who's my all-time favorite. Just because there's a lot of depth to her, and having written the entirety of the OZ, that story is done, and I can't wait for everybody to read it. Seeing the journey that she's taken, I'm proud of her, which is like a weird thing to say about a fictional character. But she contains depths and multitudes and secrets and revelations, all of which readers will get to see over the course of our next 2 campaigns.
Yeah, because you did do that on Kickstarter. Was there any particular reason why you decided to go the Kickstarter route with it? Yeah,
there are a couple. You know, Kickstarter had been something that I had wanted to do for a long time. I'm friendly with a lot of local creators in Los Angeles who had a lot of success on Kickstarter. Notably, my friend Charlie Stickney, the creator of White Ash. He and I are buds. We talk frequently, at least a couple times a week. And so, you know, people like him, Russell Nahelty, who's got a laundry list of Kickstarter projects, my buddy Rylan Grant, who we came up together in the Action Lab trenches. He's got a Kickstarter going on right now for his book, The Jump, which you should back right now. You know, David Schrader and Clay Adams, who did the Nightmare Theater horror anthology that I was a part of over the summer. So those guys, and Carla Nappi, writer of Duplicate, which just came out from Second Sight this week as well, which you should definitely pick up. So all of them together, you know, I would see them at local signings, I would see them at cons, and so, you know, we would hang out every time we'd see each other. And they were all kind of trying to press gang me, being like, you should really do a Kickstarter, you should really do a Kickstarter. And at the time, I was like, I don't know. Like, I don't know if I want to do that. And it was Charlie that really kind of shook me out of it. And he said, listen, you know, there are people that go to their shop every Wednesday. They're the Wednesday Warriors, right? I was like, yeah. And they're like, now imagine the people who you see at cons every month. Those are the people who are buying their books primarily at cons. Yeah. Well, you know, there are some people that buy their books exclusively on Comixology. And I was like, yeah, okay, I'm following. He goes, well, there are some people that primarily buy their books on Kickstarter. That's where they buy their books. And I realized, like, oh, there's a whole demographic of readers that I've done no outreach to. And so, the gears started turning. And then what wound up happening was the pandemic. Diamond had their shutdown. And I think that sent shockwaves to the industry. I think everybody started thinking, well, what am I going to do? And a lot of acquisitions pipelines that had been open suddenly constricted. There were a lot of publishers that had expressed interest in the OZ, but never like, where's the contract? You don't have it until you give me a contract. And so I realized, like, we had 2 issues of the OZ done. And I was like, well, the pandemic shut everything down, and there's no cons. And I have 2 issues of a book that I really feel strongly about. Why don't I solve one problem with another? And I'll introduce myself to the Kickstarter community with my absolute A game. And it'll give the OZ that kind of home. And boy, at the same time, it sounds confident when I say it that way. But it felt like jumping out of a plane. You're kind of like, oh boy, I hope the chute opens. And thankfully, I think the chute opened really is better than I could have hoped. People seem to really respond to that book. And so we're hard at work on the next installment. We had some COVID-related delays for the art production side of things. But artist Ruben Rojas is back in the saddle. He's drawn. We're getting close to a critical mass of pages. So I'm hoping in the next month or two we'll start the second campaign. But it's beautiful, the work that he's doing. And like I've said, the series is written. So that's 100% done. So knock on wood, as long as Ruben doesn't get hit by a car, like this will be all set. But it just feels like the whole experience made me think there's a real diaspora of readership. People talk about all the time, oh, the comics industry, it's dwindling. There's less and less and less readers, and maybe there's some element of truth to it. But I think it's a fragmented landscape, and any creator should be thinking about their work in this industry in existential terms. How do we bring that diaspora back together and have them break bread together? And that's something I'm thinking about with all the concepts I work on, because I tried to work on stuff that's maybe not quite direct market friendly, but it's also now in the way that we distribute these things. And so the OZ, I think, was really vindicating in that regard. And I've said, people keep asking, oh, is it going to come out from another publisher? And I've said, we don't have any plans with publishers at the moment. If that changes, I'll be sure to let people know. But I am committed, regardless, whatever happens. This book will be completed on Kickstarter. I will not allow any publisher to not let us finish this on Kickstarter. That is a non-starter for me, because the Kickstarter community, they're the ones that put their money where their mouths are for that book. And so it is the absolute least I can do is make sure that those readers can finish the book as it was intended.
Yeah, that's really good. It's interesting you say, because I think there are a lot of ways that people consume comics these days. It's not the old Wednesday, the Wednesday Warriors are still there, although less so in the middle of a pandemic.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly made, I consume more stuff on Comixology these days because I simply can't physically get to a comic shop. So it's like, it's good to explore those different groups. And I think, like you say, Kickstarter is a great unifier in that you will get comics readers who read digital, who read physical, who like to, all of that. So it's nice to have all of them together in one place.
Yeah. And I will say the other thing that hopefully I'm not talking out of school when I say this, but it's also it shines a light on how dysfunctional the direct market pre-order system is.
Yes.
Kickstarter, I got to say, it was the easiest thing in the world to be like, here's a link, buy it at this link. And, it takes 2 minutes to set up a Kickstarter account, and then boom, you've got your credit card in there, and then you're off to the races. Whereas, you got to call your comic shop, you got to tell them the pre-order code. Sometimes the comic shop doesn't have that issue of previews. Sometimes they just don't order it. It becomes like a whole thing. And then, the comic shops, I don't blame them. I mean, what happens if you're left on the hook for a pre-order that you never pick up?
Yeah.
They're the ones left holding the bag financially. So I will say Kickstarter is a welcome change of pace in that regard, where it's just, you cut through the red tape, and you want a book, you order it, and it'll arrive when it arrives, and I think readers feel closer having known that like we're kind of co-producers in a way.
Yeah.
And that you are directly responsible for this book existing. And I think that really drives that kind of engagement and investment in both the book and hopefully my career as a writer, which hopefully then will translate into, oh, if you like the OZ, you can pick up books like Scout's Honor, or you can go back in my bibliography and check out Spencer and Locke and go into the chapel. I want to be Baskin Robbins. I want to come up with 31 flavors, something for everybody. And I think Kickstarter is a really good way for people to feel somehow less of a risk, even though it's usually more of a financial investment.
Yeah.
It feels easier, I think, for people to dip their toes into the pool.
It does, and like you said, it does give them a little bit of feeling of ownership as well. Like, I helped make this happen. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, yeah, I'm hoping, I know it's been a little longer than I would have liked, for the next installment of the OZ to come out. Granted, it means that I don't have to split my attention between two different books. But I promise it's going to be worth the wait. I'm very excited with where the series is coming. All I'll say is issue 1 was the quiet issue.
Blimey. That's going to be interesting then. I will have to say, how big of a fan of The Wizard of Oz are you?
Yeah, I really like The Wizard of Oz. It's one of those things. It's like, I think it comes through cultural osmosis. I saw the Judy Garland film as a kid, and I actually wound up reading a lot of the L. Frank Baum books in college. I took a class in adolescent literature, and I wound up writing a term paper about how L. Frank Baum kind of was doing the shared universe stuff decades before Marvel. And that was my term paper, was a comparative analysis between the Oz universe and the Marvel universe in the 60s. And it's one of those things that, Baum in a lot of ways was ahead of his time. Especially the way that he played with archetypes. And I think that's the thing that really grabbed me. That was the thing I had the most fun with the OZ, is that, just through cultural osmosis, Dorothy, Tin Man, Scarecrow, Cowardly Lion, Toto. And those are such strong archetypes, but then they're malleable. They bend in certain ways, but they all still feel true to the characters. And so seeing how the Tin Man can evolve into the Tin Soldier, for example, where he's a character he's been sort of blown up and put back together so many times that he's turned into sort of this patchwork juggernaut. That's super cool to me. Seeing the way that we're going to tackle the Cowardly Lion in issue 2, which anybody who's picked up issue 1, you can see a little teaser at the end of Ruben's amazing design for the lion. I think that's his favorite out of all the characters. What happens to Courage? Courage when you're fighting for yourself is very different when you're a head of state, when you're the king of the animal kingdom. What does Courage become then? And there's certainly a story of legacy that goes on in his story that I think will bond him to Dorothy in a big way. But yeah, it's just, seeing those sorts of characters and then being able to remix them. That's what I like the most. I always gravitate towards strong imagery and then figuring out how can I twist it. And boy, you really can't do, as far as source material goes, you really can't do much better than The Wizard of Oz.
That's true, because I did like how you took those recognizable elements, because we all, like you say, we all know The Wizard of Oz, and then just do something really different with them, but it's still true to that original archetype. We've got some fun stuff in planned, and it's just, I don't know, certain ways it was a little therapeutic. I guess light spoilers on is that Toto's story in this book, which is probably my favorite. It's probably my single favorite thing of that issue. And I think that was very personal for me. For longtime fans of my social media, I have a little Cairn Terrier at home, Ruby. But before that, I had my parents' terrier, Holly. And I started writing the OZ the same month that we took Holly in. And I got those pages with Toto about 2 months after she passed. And it's funny, without spoiling too much, Toto wasn't supposed to be in the series for very long. But Holly passed from cancer, and so we buried her about a week before everything shut down from the pandemic.
And as we were taking her to like radiation, I said, well, I can't do this in my work. And so Toto was supposed to be like a Ben Kenobi figure where he shows up and then, sacrifices himself. And I'm like, nope, not doing that. So Toto actually has a much meatier role through the whole series. He's going to be part of Dorothy's crew, just like the Tin Soldier and the Lion. And so seeing the way that Ruben draws Toto, I'm just like, gets me every single time. But yeah, it sort of is my love letter to my puppy in a lot of ways. And so yeah, thrilled with how it turned out.
Well, I'm glad, because Toto is my favourite part of that. I'll admit.
Yeah.
Another favourite thing I have is going to the chapel,
Which
which I think is immensely underrated, but that might just be me.
No, I'm glad you said that. I mean, that's a book that's, I think, the most direct market counter programming I've ever written. I can't tell you how hard it was to get that book off the ground. On the heels of Spencer and Locke, which, was about as well received as an indie book could have been when it came out. I mean, it was optioned. It got 5 Ringo nominations. It was like, and for an Action Lab title, it was certainly making a dent. And I was like, the next book I want to do is Die Hard meets Wedding Crashers. And I can't tell you how many people were like, I don't get it. Or like, well, it seems like a funny concept, but we don't know how to sell this thing. So I give Action Lab a lot of credit, like that they at least were like, well, we trust you. We know you can pull it off. So run with it. But yeah, I really like that book. I feel like that was a lot of my indie books seemed like the little indies that could, like, they're very underestimated until they come out. And then people are like, oh yeah, of course that makes sense. And I'm like, where were you when I was pitching this? But yeah, a lot of that book speaks to my beliefs in the comics industry as a whole. Is, you can pitch to the Wednesday Warriors, and I love the Wednesday Warriors, but like there's a much wider readership out there, potential readership. And so people who might not like Spencer and Locke, either based on the content or based on the premise, or just they're not, newspaper strip fans, I can say, well, listen, you don't read comics. What if you check this one out? Tell me what you think. That's my comic for non-comics readers. And it was inspired by I was the best man at my oldest friend's wedding, and I did a terrible job. It was the universe truly conspired against me. It was inspired directly by the cursed bachelor party that I had planned. I wound up getting a kidney stone 48 hours before I was supposed to fly cross country for this bachelor party. So I was grounded. The doctor said, you cannot fly. So I'm sitting there on painkillers, and then I find out the Airbnb was trashed. I had rented inflatable sumo suits for the backyard, not knowing the backyard was at like a 45-degree incline. The booze cruise got canceled, like all sorts of stuff. And I'm trying to like troubleshoot this in California while my friends are in Asheville, North Carolina. And I thought to myself while I was sort of buzzed on painkillers, well, thank God this didn't happen during the wedding. And then I said, but what if it did? And so I started thinking, like, what's the worst thing that could happen at this wedding? And I thought, first thing was, if the father or the bride hired some leg breakers to get my friend to buzz off. And I was like, no, that's not the worst thing. The worst thing would be if this bride got cold feet. And that became the emotional core of going to the chapel. I think, we see in pop culture all the time the guys having cold feet, but having a woman with cold feet, I think it was kind of different. It was a different angle. And I think also, I thought it was important. I love Spencer and Locke, but I think at least the first volume, a weakness that we had was the lack of representation. And that was sort of structurally unavoidable. George Santiago Jr. and I talked about it. Like, should we make Locke a character of color? And I said, I think it will veer into stereotype if we do that, especially because I'm a white writer. Suddenly saying like the gritty urban Calvin and Hobbes, if it's a character of color, they're going to say, oh, well, it's because he's a character of color, and that's not the kind of representation I want to do. But I wanted to sort of make up for that in my next work. And so, having 2 romantic leads being men of color was really important to me. This was before Crazy Rich Asians came out. So like having like an Asian man as like the sexy dreamboat character was like kind of rare at the time. and having sort of the blurred the black nerd character as as another romantic lead. That was also something that hadn't really seen much of outside of like maybe This Is Us, and even then Randall has never really been portrayed as like a super romantic character. And so I was like, this is sort of a way of rectifying past inequities in my one and only piece of work at this point. But yeah, it's an important book for me, and I feel like it's sort of it was certainly a left turn, but I think it's one that showed a lot of people that, oh, he's not just the guy who's going to do like ruin my childhood, like he's also the guy who's going to ruin marriage.
Yay!
But yeah, I like I said, Baskin Robbins, 31 flavors, and this was certainly a different kind of flavor that I wanted to make sure we had.
Yeah, because I was going to say it's such a contrast to Spencer and Locke in a good way.
Yes.
Because
it was a reaction. It was honestly a reaction to Spencer and Locke, just because every time I write a book, I get a to-do list, and it's sort of, this is what I want to do in a book. And I cross a few things off every time I write a book, but I usually add a bunch of things on. And so I was like, I don't want to do something super gritty in the next book. And I want to have a bigger cast of characters and a more diverse set of characters. And I was like, you know what? Let's do it in one setting. Let's see how that goes. And no word balloons, or no thought captions. Let's just make this thing really hard on me. And yeah, it was definitely, it's certainly the longest book that I've ever taken to outline. Maybe besides Spencer and Locke 3, and that's just because I've been bouncing between projects. But that took months to outline that book. But thankfully, once I did, there was very little deviation. That was a book that when it was outlined, it was set in stone. And I think I scripted the whole thing in about 2 months, just shotgunned right through it. Yeah, Gavin Guidry and I, we had to kind of like play the whole thing out like a football play, where it was sort of like he did a fully 3D chapel. We sort of consulted on what rooms needed to be where to make the scenes work. And then it was kind of like, all right, Jesse's here, Tom's here, Emily's here. And really, we kind of did like the X's and O's through scene to scene to scene to make sure that it all fit within the space.
Yeah, because I was going to say there's a lot of moving pieces of plot there in terms of the number of characters and little things that happen and then come back later on. And yeah, I was going to ask how it was to juggle all of that.
It was tough. It was a hard script to write. It was a hard book to write. Like I said, it took months to get the outline down. And granted, I was still pretty green at everything. At that point, all I had written was Spencer and Locke 1, and I think I was in the process of outlining volume 2. So this was basically like my second or third book. So I was still kind of figuring everything out. And yeah, it was a hard book. And that's not on top of, I've said this now, having outlined, I'm working on another comedy right now. Comedy's hard. It's so much harder than drama, because drama, you just have to make the story math add up, that like the story makes sense. Comedy, you have to do all that and be funny. And so you really have to be pulling like triple duty for every scene. And so there's a lot of thought that has to go into it. And that's not on top of just figuring out like comics hit differently than film or television. So you have to kind of figure out like one-liners hit a lot easier, but like physical comedy, it's very easy to go overboard. It starts going into like, Garth Ennis territory. And so you have to really kind of like pull back and figure out like, how do I hit that balance? So yeah, it's tough, and sometimes I'm sure a lot of writers would say it's probably to diminishing returns. Comedy's a harder sell, I think, in the direct market. But at the same time, I see my body of work as like holistic, and so I'm kind of like, I don't see my books as individual things, because I'm always thinking, what's it going to be like when I go to a con and I have all my books in front of me? And so that's why the Baskin Robbins analogy rears its ugly head again, where I'm just like, I can't just have all chocolate flavors, like I need something a little lighter. I need some sorbets in there, even just some palate cleansers, just before people kind of dive into whatever next bleak thing that I ruin their childhood with next.
So we'll mention ruining childhood, because Spencer and Locke is, Calvin and Hobbes grow up and fight crime. Did you read a lot of Calvin and Hobbes? I've never met anyone who hasn't read any, I'll be honest.
I did. I came by it honestly. I mean, I'm a third generation comics reader. My mother was a comics fan. My grandfather was a comics fan. And growing up, Calvin and Hobbes was one of my mother's favorite strips. I was born right around the time, I think Bill Watterson started, I want to say it was in 88. I think it was around Thanksgiving of 88 is when he started. I think, give or take a year or so. And I was born in 86. So, like my mom would have these Calvin and Hobbes strips in her office. She'd have them in the kitchen. And the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which was my hometown paper, had a really robust comics section. So props to them for that. I would read the comic section every morning. And, I loved Calvin and Hobbes as a kid. I just thought, oh, like the art is so, is so fun. And like Calvin seems like, such a little stinker. And like, that's so fun. But it was when I revisited it as an adult that I was like, this guy was like so ahead of his time. He was such a trailblazer. And so I had all the collections and, I would read through all those. The way that it happened, though, to do this concept is actually a little backwards. Frank Miller was the very first comics writer that made me realize as a kid that real writers made these books. Like it was the first time that like I was 7, I think, when I got Daredevil, the Man Without Fear. And it like blew my mind. And I was just like, oh, that is a voice. That's a distinct voice. That's very different than any of the other comics I'd been reading in the 90s, which sort of felt almost like the death of the author, sort of it removed, so to speak. The art was the voice. This, it was like, oh, you can hear a voice. So when I decided to kind of coax myself into maybe trying to write my own comic for the first time, I was like, well, I kind of want to do an homage to Frank Miller, to classic Frank. And I thought, as a fan of like mashups and music remixes and like, I said, what's the weirdest thing that I could throw against old school Frank Miller? And the problem is like a lot of the preliminary ideas I had, it felt very shock for shock value's sake. You could do like The Wire meets Sesame Street, where Colossal Condor is like the drug dealer on Sesame Street. But like that's shock. And I am a big believer. Shock gets your foot in the door once. It does not build engagement. And I think shock, a lot of people turn it into something exploitive and cheap and alienating. So I was like, none of these ideas feel like an idea. It feels like a sketch. But when I thought of Calvin and Hobbes, that's like the light bulb went off. And I was like, I thought of like a hard-boiled detective, beat up, kind of grinning in the rain, and he's holding onto a stuffed animal. And I was like, what's that guy's like home life like? What was his upbringing like? And those questions turned into Spencer and Locke. And that really kind of became my meditation on trauma and particularly childhood trauma and PTSD and kind of how our childhood scars shape us as adults, and particularly unorthodox coping mechanisms. Memento is one of my favorite movies of all time. And so the idea of having a character who sees the world differently because of his disability and has to kind of leverage that to navigate the world, that was something that I thought was really not just interesting, but I thought it was kind of powerful and kind of inspiring. And so, that it's probably the proudest thing I've ever been working on anything. It's a book that certainly changed my life. It was actually this week marked the 4-year anniversary of the first issue coming out.
I was gonna say, how does it feel to look back and think how did you feel 4 years ago when it first came out?
I was terrified. Every issue of Spencer and Locke that has ever come out, I've gone to sleep terrified. Thinking, is this going to be the issue where they turn on us? Is this going to be the issue where we push the envelope too hard? George Santiago Jr. and I, we always had conversations about like, how do we tell this story in a way that's like respectful and humane? Doesn't necessarily pull its punches, but that like we're not trying to be gross. I can say, for example, the second issue in particular, which I think might have been some of the more combustible material that we've ever worked on. We redrew that flashback page 3 times because we made it was this cannot be seen as sexy, this cannot be seen as funny, this cannot be seen as titillating or comedic or punching down. We have a really thin tightrope to walk. And so it's certain ways I pinch myself saying I can't believe I've gotten as far as I have in those 4 years. And then talking about like what I was saying earlier, that's where the gratefulness comes in. On the other hand, I keep thinking like, oh, there's so much more I want to do. Pacing myself is the hardest challenge I have as a writer. I feel good about the quality of output that I put out. I like to work better on the speed. We're still working on Spencer and Locke Volume 3. We're doing a Garfield-themed serial killers picking off the Peanuts gang. And Spencer and Locke and an unexpected new partner kind of find themselves in the crosshairs. The thing I keep saying is between volumes 1 and 2, I didn't have any other projects. So I kind of wrote them as consecutively as one could. I've written 7 books since then, since volume 2. And so I think in part there's a lot of moving parts to this project in particular. Volume 2, we did Calvin and Hobbes versus Beetle Bailey. There's not a ton of preconceived notions about Beetle Bailey, and we were even able to put in like High and Lois in there and Brenda Starr. This, it's like climbing Everest 3 times. Everybody has notions about Peanuts. Everybody has notions about Garfield. Everybody has notions about Calvin and Hobbes, and so doing all the research while juggling other projects, it's taken longer than I would have liked. And that's entirely on me, as the guy still writing it. But George and I are in full agreement that we would much rather it take time and get it right. This is likely the 3rd and final arc. We are writing it as such, as sort of the exclamation point at the end of the sentence that is Spencer and Locke. And I want to make sure we do it right. And so there's a lot of moving parts to it, but I'm finally at a spot where my dance card is starting to open up again. And I'm kind of like, all right, like let's take what I've learned in all these other books and apply it. But I love Spencer and Locke. I can't wait. It's the book that sells the most for me at conventions. It has for a very long time. I can't wait for conventions to come back so I can start selling it again. But that book's my baby, and it changed my life.
I was going to say I'm quite happy to wait as a fan of Spencer and Locke. I'm quite happy to wait because if it's going to be good, which I know it will be, the wait will be worth it.
It'll be worth it.
So I was going to say, is there yay, volume 3?
Yes,
whenever you get around to it, no pressure.
It is happening, and I can tell you the team's back together for it. We've all committed for it. George is excited to do it. Jason Smith is excited to ride shotgun with him on the colors. So yeah, we are thrilled to come back on that. Monhouse and Joe Mulvey are excited to do variants as well. So we're getting the team back for this book, and it's we've got some very ambitious things planned for it. This is just as much our love letter to Bill Watterson as it is to Frank Miller, and I don't want to spoil too much, but this is going to be sort of really the real love letter that we've been building towards for a long time.
That's really good to know, because it is one of those books that, although it has a lot of bleak moments, there is still Locke is such a great character with it. Poor guy. He's close to my heart. I
Spencer and Locke. I didn't grow up in an abusive household. But I have my own experiences with trauma, for sure. And I always say Spencer's me in a good day and Locke's me in a bad day. And so, those characters, they do have a lot of my voice to them. Locke is just a character, I think he's kind of in the vein of almost like a Peter Parker, where, you beat him down and he's so beaten down, but he's the guy who's just too stubborn and he will not stay down. And I love that about him as a character. I think it's always something that's very inspiring to me. Anytime I get my legs kicked out from under me in the comics industry, which happens more than you'd expect, I always think about Locke. That's the thing that gets me back up off the mat. And so, he's a character that means a lot to me, and having readers who have grown up in abusive households, or who have dealt with mental illness, or who have dealt with trauma, coming to me at cons and saying that the character meant something to them. I mean, I love getting reviews and all that, but that's the best praise I'm ever going to get as a writer.
Yeah.
So it really means a lot, and I just I'm thrilled that people have been enjoying the book, and I'm glad that they've been patient with me. And we are committed to making sure that Volume 3 will be worth the wait.
Excellent. So we've mentioned that Spencer and Locke Volume 3 is coming. Before we finish, is there anything else that you're currently working on that people should know about?
Boy, well, there's a lot of things that aren't announced yet or don't have homes yet. There's a variety of things. I'm working on a horror book right now. I'm working on I've written a sci-fi YA book that we're starting to slowly put together into production. Spencer and Locke 3, a comedy that we're in the process of trying to find a home for. So that's 4 unwritten books, plus finishing the OZ. Those are all really important to me. So that's almost an even half dozen right there. George and I, we just worked on a one-shot called Roxy Rewind, which was in the pages of the Big Hype anthology. That's sort of our love letter to classic Spider-Man. Actually, you know what? I keep forgetting about Grand Theft Astro. So that is an even half dozen. We're slowly but surely getting the artwork together on that. That's been in the process for a very long time. Book's written. It's Fast and the Furious meets Back to the Future in space. I love that book. My only regret is it's not out already. But just based on like COVID and like the craziness with artist scheduling, it's slowly starting to trickle out. But I'm very happy with how that book has turned out, and I think that'll really fit nicely in that space. It's not as bleak as anything I've written, but it's really fun and action packed. So, that's sort of on my plate right now. But I get restless easy, so there's a lot more stuff that I'm sure I'll be working on in the months to come.
Excellent. And one final question. Is there anything that you're currently reading that you would like to recommend to anyone?
Boy, well, I can't say enough good things about the X-Men line over at Marvel. I've said that those books have gotten me through the pandemic. I'm jealous at how just bold and brash and ambitious those books are. So, I saw previews for X Corp today, and I was really excited to read that. That'll be at the same day as Scouts Honor number 5. So sure those up. Let's see some other books. Giga by my friend Alex Pactadel. You should really read. I'm sure you've read it. Red Fork.
I have.
Terrific. Yeah. I think that's my favorite of Alex's work. James Tynan's work on Batman and Joker. I would not have expected to like a Joker book. The movie was distinctly not for me. But it's kind of a little bit of a marketing misdirect because it's really Jim Gordon, the series, not Joker, the series. And I love it 2 issues in. So yeah, those are the ones that are coming to mind. But boy, I hate those questions because there's so much stuff that I think of after the fact. Yeah. And I'm like, oh, I should have shouted out this guy. And you know what? I'll give Charlie Stickney's White Ash a shout. You should really, if you haven't read it, terrific stuff. And I say that if he wasn't so damn friendly, I'd be jealous. But he's just a seriously terrific and talented creator.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I know you have to get off and take the dog to daycare.
Well, yes.
But yeah, it was wonderful talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and I shall be continuing to check out Scouts Honor. I'm looking forward to issue 5 next month.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me.
You're welcome.